Welcome to Kevs Travel Stories. Each week I'll be bringing you a story from the weird and wonderful world of travel, a world that can change the way you see life and love and even the way we find meaning. Places that are iconic and sometimes surprising and even terrifying. So sit back and enjoy while we go on a magical mystery tour together. Welcome to Kevin's Travel Story, and this episode we're going for a trip down memory lane, which is very poignant for me because it's the first time I left my country, which at the time was the UK and London, and it was the start of something that would turn out into a life passion, travel. But I didn't know that when the first notice went round to parents that the Jesuit grammar school I was at was organising a trip to Venice, no less. And we were offered places on this if you could come up with the deposit. I had a conversation with my best friend Paul and my parents, and it was agreed that if I did a paper round and provided so much towards the funds, I could go. Paul secured his own deal, and a good few of us actually from my class decided that we were going on this first trip abroad. Well, it was quite a lot of organising to do. You had to get passports. I didn't have a passport. That cost a fair few bob. Then, as the date got closer, we were advised to get traveller's checks. Some of you would never have heard of traveller's checks. You went along, I remember we got Orient Express, and you had £20 checks that you signed, and you brought your passport along, and in a foreign country, as we called them in those days, they would change them into local currency. We also, excitedly, a couple of days beforehand, actually got lira. And there was hundreds of lira for £1. You got this wad of notes, you felt like a millionaire. The big day arrived. I remember packing my sun cream, and we met at school. We went down, caught the train to Waterloo Station and got on the train down to Dover. The train went on to the actual ferry, and we went across the English Channel. I'll never forget it. The white cliffs of Dover behind us, the choppy waters, the French coastline appearing. I'd never been to a foreign country. This is just 20 years after the war, and we had a sort of certain attitude, and it was a different time, remember. I can never forget the passport control. We had to take our suitcases out and open them, and like a James Bond movie, the French passport officer would go through, close it, and I remember the sound of the chalk being put across to say you were okay to proceed. And off we went to Paris. I'll never forget it. The excitement was so much I could hardly speak. Paris, so many different smells and tastes and the whole vibe. It was absolutely incredible. Everybody looked different. They looked more chic. They didn't look quite as dull and dreary as fellow Londoners, even though we were in the 60s and the summer of love was around the corner. But there was something so exotic, and the smell, perfume and coffee. I'd never quite had any sense of such difference. We saw our train. It was the Orient Express. Now, I kid you not. In those days, it wasn't the plush 10,000 euros 4-day trip Orient Express. This was the migrant train, which took migrant workers from Paris back to Turkey, and we were just catching a lift to Venice before it went on to Istanbul. And we had couchettes. I'll never forget standing beside this big beast, green, and the steam coming out, because this was the steam train era, and the excitement of getting on, and we had our name above our couchette, and we sat down, the 6 of us in our carriage, and we started to chatter, and as the train took off, the excitement grew, and then a man came in and changed the cushions, and these beds came out magically, and he put covers down and sheets, and I had my own bed. I was on the bottom of the bunk, and I remember I drove Paul and my friends mad because I gave a commentary, opening up the blinds and looking out as the landscape and these extraordinary names of different cities, and we went through passport control on each. This was before the EU. Each time we reached a border, the passport people came on, checked our passports before we were allowed to proceed right the way through to Italy. And then a great thing happened. When the train got in the morning, I'd finally fallen asleep. I was awoken by the noise of the beep, beep, beep on the whistle. Opened my eyes. The train came to a sudden juddering halt. I got out of my bed and went and looked out of the side window, And there I heard the tinkling as a little trolley was being pushed along. Right in front of me were the pink Alps. I'll never forget it. And this beautiful blue early morning dawn sky. And this old lady was pushing this trolley along. And she said, "Croissant, monsieur, croissant." And I took some of my notes out. And it was the first time I smelt fresh coffee and tasted fresh coffee and croissant. And that was the beginning of an enduring love affair that's gone on ever since. So I thank the journey just for that. Well, finally, we arrived in Venice. The train came right into the centre, to the train station there on the Grand Canal. What an absolute miracle that was to walk out and to see this winter wonderland, extraordinary Disney-type palaces, water, boats, vaporetta. It was just really the most extraordinary place. If you were going to be away for the first time ever, can you top Venice? I don't think so. So we started our 5-day sojourn because it took a couple of days to get there and a couple of days to get back. We were staying in a nunnery, believe it or not, near the Accademia. Because we were taught by religious priests, the Jesuits, they had some arrangement with the nunnery, and we stayed in the nunnery, which had been turned into a pensione. There was 3 to a room, and I remember the first time we got up for breakfast, we were all going, "Ah!" the way kids do. There was a sort of a gruel, a coffee gruel, which was horrible. But you had these lovely fresh white rolls, and you could dip them in the coffee, and that was one way to set yourself up. Did we get into the art of this great city? Did we become bowled over by Bellini? I'm afraid to say no. What we, as 12 and 13-year-olds, really got in love with was the shops that sold flick knives. Yes, I'm not kidding, actual flick knives. This was like cocaine to a 13-year-old. Beautiful flick knives that were made of wood and steel, and you just went click. I can remember the little button, the feel of the button, and the knife would flick out, and we'd have mock fights. Then if you were really, really ambitious, they had stilettos. It was a flat blade shot out from the end of your knife. We bought these up en masse. We had to post them back to the UK because you couldn't take them. We were warned about that. And this was something that fascinated us. And then they had these pistols that had actually plastic caps. And you put them in and they fired. A flame came out at the end and they made a real noise. That's what preoccupied us. We also got to taste Chianti. I'll never forget it. And we went on little secret drinking expeditions. And we got a little bit out of order. And the nadir came near the last night where we were put on gondolas. And instead of listening and being caroused by the gondolas, we started shouting, it makes me cringe to even think of it, Chelsea football songs, because there were a lot of Chelsea supporters at the school I was in. That is probably still ringing in the ears of some of the poor Venetians that had to suffer us that night. I have to say we did because of a particular teacher, Mr. Hurst, who was the man that I loved. He put me in touch with ballet. He was the shining light. He was the Beatles of our generation as we really got into culture. And he took us to the Accademia and pointed out some of the paintings, and the penny dropped because later me and Paul did both study history of art. So that was the first explosion of travel. And I can remember coming back and feeling when we arrived back in Dower, London, and I met my parents who greeted us. And I remember feeling, I didn't really want to talk about it too much and feeling a bit strange. I'd bought John Lennon glasses. So it was about time of Robert, circular ones, blue. And I was becoming a bit of a hippie. You could become a hippie or you could become skinhead. You had a choice of one or the other, really. And I went the hippie route. And I became a bit strange once I came back. I didn't want to talk about it. Something had happened. And it was only later I realized that first trip, the tender age of 13, I'd started to grow up. And I have to thank my school, Mr. Hurst, Paul, of course, my best pal, and Venice, for setting me on a journey that would bring me back to Venice 65 years later for big birthdays, family occasions, and a love affair that's endured. Coffee, Venice, and love. What more could you ask? The seeds were sown on that first school trip. Thank you, Venice.